In this episode of the unknown side of WoW, we delve into the interesting tidbits and more obscure pieces of WoW's infamous Warlock class. We will be shifting primarily to the hidden obscurities within the class, lesser known strategies, and maybe just an Easter egg that you've never heard of for the class in general. Now, while it may make sense to associate the Warlock class with something like metal music or even rock due to them being a bit edgier, Blizzard themselves actually poses Warlocks more as opera enjoyers. This is mostly seen in the more parody-like version of WoW, Hearthstone, a card game wholly dedicated to the lore and wonder of Warcraft as a genre. Hearthstone isn't considered to be canon in the WoW universe, at least the events that take place in it. But this isn't to say that Hearthstone hasn't influenced official Warcraft media as time goes on. The biggest example of this is the official appearance of N'Zoth, the final old god to be fully revealed to players in the BFA expansion. N'Zoth actually didn't have any known look until Hearthstone created a card for him, and then it would be carried forward into WoW when the old god finally made his debut on screen. So, it's not impossible for links of Hearthstone and WoW to be made into actual canon, but it has to occur in Hearthstone first, usually, because it's already pulling from sources of WoW, and just kinda stretching out its world building. Because of this, the Warlock class is thus associated with opera and orchestral music, mainly from the Festival of Legends expansion. There are many cards depicting demonic servants and Warlock casters performing a variety of classical music, and even the main Hearthstone-only created character, Rin, Orchestrator of Doom, is plastered basically everywhere to solidify this. There's even a card called Fanatum, Lord of the Opera for Warlocks, a play on Phantom of the Opera music originally from 1986, later being made into a film of the same name in 2004. So, while it might not actually occur in the official game of WoW, we can see that Blizzard themselves chose to associate the class with the classical genre, perhaps influencing them on how they design spells on occasion. Speaking of music, we have a reference to a real-world band. In patch 7.2 of Legion, Blizzard gave every single existing class for the time a brand new class mount tailored specifically to the likeness of a class. So, DK's got an undead dragon, Paladin a super light infused horse, and Warlocks a wrath steed. During the quest chain to obtain your class mount, Blizzard had the Warlock complete a quest called Give Me Fuel, Give Me Fire. This is a reference to the Metallica band song named Fuel. This is indicated in the first lyric of the song where the vocalist, James Hetfield, sings Give me fuel, give me fire, give me that which I desire. So ironically, while Blizzard may lean classical music towards Warlocks, they get a reference in their class-specific quest that's metal music. This is mostly because the quest asks you to collect 50 Owl Beast blood to help fuel a portal to the designated world Zoroth to locate and obtain your mount, hence the reference to Metallica. Following more references made in Legion, we have a couple of the legendaries you could obtain at the time. If you aren't sure how these worked, basically any source of content had a very small chance to reward you a legendary for your class at random, and the longer you went on without one, the higher your chances would become. When it came to Stratton's Sleepless Shackles, it's actually a reference to the popular musical artist Flume. Flume is a highly revered Australian DJ and music producer who helped popularize a genre of music called future bass. His most popular song, Never Be Like You, has over 825 million streams on Spotify, and even his lesser popular songs have hundreds of millions of plays at a time. Flume's real name is Harley Edward Stryden, and his last name can be seen in the legendary item itself in the first word. This is more apparent following his name in the legendary because Flume also has a popular song called Sleepless. And if you weren't convinced enough, the flavor text of the item reads, "The only risk is that you'll go insane," which is a direct quote from another one of Flume's songs, Insane. Another legendary reference comes in the form of the Lessons of Spacetime shoulder slot item. These shoulder pads actually reference the world-renowned theoretical physicist and cosmologist Stephen Hawking. The quote of the legendary itself reads, "The increase of chaos is what distinguishes the past from future," giving a direction to time, and then proceeds to credit a seemingly unknown character in WoW simply named Hawking, Scholar of Spacetime. The legendary itself helps appeal to the otherworldly research Stephen Hawking purposed himself with because of the dimensional rift destruction Warlocks are given during Legion, which essentially tears a rift in multiple dimensions and sends forth terrifying bolts of damage at the Warlock's enemies. Even the name of the legendary itself references Stephen, as Stephen's very first book published was titled The Large-Scale Structure of Space-Time, or otherwise understood as a book that lessons the reader on space-time, leading to the name of the legendary itself. However, the flavor text of legendary is actually a slightly reconstructed popular phrase of Stephen Hawking's. The increase of disorder or entropy is what distinguishes the past from the future, giving a direction to time. So it's only a few changed words from the original, but is a clear commemoration to the scientists. made just 1 year before Stephen Hawking's passing in March of 2018. The last legendary reference comes from the cloak Reap and Sow, which is simply a clear dedication to the common phrase, you reap what you sow. The phrase itself, meaning everything you do, is a result of things you've done in the past. The legendary itself causing your Reap Souls ability to last 2.5 seconds longer per soul shard you use, thus reaping what you sow. The flavor text of the legendary also reads, if you reap what you sow, well, I guess I better get going then. The second part of the flavor text is pretty unknown if it's supposed to be a reference to something directly, other than just a continuation of the original phrase to be taken at face value. In vanilla/classic WoW, there is a short questline involving an imp named Impsy. He will ask you to bring him a fell cloth as a gesture of good faith in Felwood before then offering you his follow-up quest. His first follow-up quest is called The Wrong Stuff, which is likely a reference to the 1979 novel The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe. The original book was mostly a detailing of the US and Soviet Union space race and exploration as a whole, which is later adapted into a film in 1983. Ironically, the quest text itself doesn't actually involve any sort of direct reference to the space race or even the task you perform. It's just likely a play on the words of the original book, and it's just a little extra Easter egg for any frequent readers. When creating a Warlock for the first time in the older versions of WoW, one of the first Warlock trainer NPCs you might meet are located in Stormwind. These trainers all reside in a tavern called the Slaughtered Lamb, and are specifically in the cellar levels of the tavern below, hiding from the public eye so they may not be perceived in public opinion for their actions. The name of the tavern itself is actually a reference to the pub in the comedy horror film An American Werewolf in London, written and directed by John Landis. The film's plot revolves around two American hitchhikers stumbling into a pub of the same name in WoW and then encountering the local werewolf in the movie, the werewolf in WoW being the insidious Warlock below the tavern instead. Ironically, this same tavern is quite popular amongst roleplayers in WoW nowadays as well, sometimes creating very similar events to the film itself, whether it be intentional or not. Alexander Calder is yet another Warlock trainer players may encounter during their endeavors, but this time is located in Ironforge. His name is very likely calling to his real-world counterpart of the same name. In real life, Alexander Calder was an American sculptor and was famous for his large sheet metal mobiles. Mobiles in the art world are a type of sculpture meant to take advantage of the principle of equilibrium. This basically means that the object that hangs from the rods will balance each other out, so the rods they hang on stay horizontal. Usually these are seen in nursery homes for infants and will hang over a crib to entertain the child. More popularly known was that Alexander was actually the inventor of the mobile design with sheet metal, earning the name mobile due to the hanging objects all moving independently from one another. Appropriately, the room you encounter the NPC in is decorated with multiple mobiles to help indicate the reference more clearly to the players. There really seems to be a lot of Warlock trainer references in WoW, as a trainer in Brill, a common starting area for undead, is named Rupert Bach. This is a reference to the real-world writer Robert Bloch. Robert is the author of the popular book called Psycho, published in 1959. The book itself follows the story of a character named Norman Bates, who is a caretaker at a motel who has a complicated relationship with his mother. Eventually, Norman becomes involved in a series of murders, and it creates one of the most renowned horror novels in the real world for its time. Only a year later, the story was then adapted into a film of the same name by Alfred Hitchcock, which loosely inspired a TV series named Bates Motel from 2013 to 2017. All of this, and WoW chooses to honor the writer by placing him as an undead Warlock NPC for players to interact with. It seems pretty fitting, and if you were the NPC, you'd probably go a little psycho too. Considering we're still somewhat on the topic of undead NPCs and Warlock trainers, there's yet another reference to a real-world counterpart following this criteria. We promise this is the last one, and we'll move on to some of the more unknown factors of Warlock soon. In the Undercity, players can find an NPC named Richard Kerwin. The trainer's surname has a very strong resemblance to the name Kerwin, which is actually a reference to the short story, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward by H.P. Lovecraft. One of the main characters in this novel is named Joseph Kerwin, who investigates the strange behaviors of Dexter Ward in the book. During this time, Kerwin discovers Joseph attempting to resurrect his ancient ancestor with necromancy, a trait not typically associated with Warlocks in modern WoW, but this NPC was created before the release of Death Knights, and thus had a bit more of a connection to the undead than any of the other classes would. The NPC, Richard Kerwin, though, is undead himself, so that's a larger indicator. A bit more convincing is the rogue trainers in Undercity, who are all undead as well, and are named Carolyn Ward, Miles Dexter, and Gregory Charles, each surname bearing a name of one of the characters from the original novel published in 1941. On to some more gameplay-related mechanics for the Warlock. Did you know Warlocks used to not be able to cast their ritual summoning in the Netherstorm? The Netherstorm itself in WoW used to inhabit the lush jungles of Farallon, ranging just east of Gorgon. It wasn't until the planet of Draenor underwent its sundering, similar to Azeroth, due to a spell cast by Ner'zhul. Essentially, at this point of time in the lore, the Horde had been driven back into the Dark Portal that they had traveled to Azeroth from. The resources of the Horde were beginning to dwindle, and they needed to relocate themselves to a new planet because of this. So, Ner'zhul would cast a spell that would open portals to new worlds from the Horde to conquer. Instead, what happened was giant rifts of energy formed from the twisting nether across the skies of Draenor, ripping apart reality itself and causing many natural disasters to occur. Fabrics of the twisting nether itself would crash into the lands of Draenor, and it would rip apart the lands we know as the Netherstorm, leaving many remnants of its chaotic energies in its wake. Now all that remains is a distilled land where nothing can naturally survive off the land again. To counter this, eco-domes were created, much like a greenhouse, to protect the very little remnants of Farallon after Ner'zhul's catastrophic spell. There are also many mana forges, a counter to the eco-domes that instead intend to harness the chaos of the Netherstorm for power, mainly seen ripping magic from the skies in the area. Tempest Keep being among the more famously known. Ironically, or perhaps intentionally, the general aesthetic and colors of the Netherstorm are very alike to the Delphic Expanse from the Star Trek universe. The Expanse is riddled with a large amount of unnatural anomalies and is filled with broken laws of physics, just like the chaotic nature of the WoW's Netherstorm. Because of this, starships in Star Trek do not function correctly when they are within the Expanse, and thus a Warlock cannot summon players into the Netherstorm. Prior to patch 2.4, if a Warlock ever tried to, an error message would appear on the screen that said, "Netherstorm's chaotic energies make summoning magically impossible." Among the many demons a Warlock can summon, the Felguard is one of the most iconic. With his stupidly large axe he wields and spiky apparel, he's one of the favorites for Warlock players. Apart from the fact the DPS of the Felguard has traditionally been some of the best. Though it's not often a player will actually dismiss their demon outright because you can just start summoning the one you want to replace it instead. It'll stun your current demon for a few moments while you channel the cast of your new demon, so you commit to the long duration, but there's never really a reason to actually click on the Felguard and then click on its portrait to dismiss them. It was either that, or the demon just straight up died and you would summon it back like normal so you can continue with your damage. But if you did ever find yourself in the instance you dismissed your demon instead, you may sometimes hear it say to you, "I'll be back." This is a direct reference to Arnold Schwarzenegger's popular quote of the same saying from his role in the Terminator franchise. Interestingly, the voice lines of the Felguard were also originally intended for the Doomguard summon a Warlock could perform. To summon a Doomguard, you would need to cast Ritual of Doom, which requires 4 of the players to channel to a pillar that you create. Doing so will kill one of the party members or yourself at random, and then you can enslave the demon. The Doomguard, however, could only be enslaved by the Warlock for a limited time, meaning it would likely require voice lines that indicate this. This is shown when you order your Felguard to do something, as even now it threatens you with the fact that you have limited time remaining, and it wants to kill you through the voice lines like, "Your time is running out," and "Enjoy this while you can." This would also explain why the Felguard will occasionally ask, "What happened to your friend?" when you summon him, implying you brought him out at the cost of your friend's life with the Ritual of Doom. Eventually, the Doomguard was given their own voice lines, or rather, now shared with the Felguard, as they still have the same voice lines as one another, instead of the Doomguard, not at all. Perhaps one of the least known things about Warlocks was their original cheese strategy utilized back in the Burning Crusade expansion. Many players have heard of the Warlock tank strat, which utilized a Warlock's Voidwalker demon pet, their high amount of self-healing spells like Drain Life, gear with heavy magic resistances, and stamina increases. It was most famously used for the Twin Emperors encounter in the Temple of Ahn'Qiraj raid, and even for various fights in TBC, as well for fights like the Eridar Twins in Sunwell Plateau, and Illidan Stormrage in Black Temple. This is pretty standard though, and we even saw a resemblance of the strategy when Vanilla WoW was re-released in the form of Classic. This wasn't so much of a cheese strat, however, because a lot of groups used it, and Blizzard never told them not to. If it wasn't intended, they would have just changed the fight it was used for by either nerfing it or nerfing the Warlock, which no one would have liked at the time. However, the strategy in question actually revolved around a Warlock's soulstone ability. The way soulstone works in TBC is a Warlock will spend one of their soul shards obtained from Drained Soul on creating the item. Once a soul shard is created, they can then cast it onto a target of their choice or even themselves. It places a 15-minute buff on the target that allows them to resurrect in the spot that they died at instantly, with a reduced amount of health and mana restored, allowing them to hop back into the fight or get to cover without the need of running back from a graveyard to retrieve their corpse. The neat thing about this ability is you only had to be level 18 to learn it from your Warlock trainer back in the day, making it a pretty useful tool while leveling in case you pulled too much at a time by accident. So before the Burning Crusade was out, players had started to fully learn how WoW worked, and they'd made better methods to prepare for raiding. With such early notice of an incoming raid in TBC and the changes to come, high-tier guilds would coordinate the best ways to down bosses for Realm First, or even for World First kills. One of these strategies involved just straight up having an army of Warlock ults for raids. What guilds would do is they would get ready to zone into a raid and then have at least half of the group consist of their low-level Warlocks. Since you have to be level 18 to have the soulstone, doing this was actually pretty easy and took really little effort. And thanks to ritual summoning, a high-level Warlock in your raid could get them to the instance with relative ease. So one half of the raid would soulstone their main members and then swap back to the original half. They would then repeat this process for the half that was just soulstoned and keep their buffs in the process. As the timer would not tick down when or being removed or logged out, once prepared, you can have an entire group of 25 players ready to fight a boss with 25 combat resurrections to par. This process could often be repeated for every single boss if the raid would just zone outside of the instance to meet their Warlock army and do it again. So instead of just fighting a boss in the intended manner, now everyone in the raid has a second chance at life to continue the encounter where they shouldn't have been allowed to. This was especially useful on tanks and healers, as losing them at all during the fight can sometimes mean the very end of it, as they can almost carry an entire encounter with their utility. Plus, if a tank did die and the boss starts to melee the poor Fury Warrior, one-shotting them, now they can both get up and keep doing damage to the boss again. The only issue with this strategy is that not a lot of guilds really wanted to have all 25 of their members to require an alt Warlock parked outside of each instance for the strat to work. Plus, you'd need to soulstone the entire raid again after every boss, usually. This is because the buff was only 15 minutes long, so after a boss dies, you would not get the full use out of it due to trash packs leading to the next encounter. Even with this strategy in mind, you could still have a wipe take place and then need to reapply it for another, very unintended pull. Now you're able to understand why super tryhard guilds were able to down bosses quicker than they intended in the Burning Crusade, which is pretty ironic considering a lot of bosses in TBC still took upwards to 20 to 30 days to kill sometimes. For Kael'thas specifically though, this strategy could not be used and made the raid significantly harder. Like mentioned earlier in the video, Warlocks could not summon people into the Netherstorm until the final patch of the expansion 2.4. Meeting stones also did not work for Warlock armies because you had to match the level of the content you were being summoned to, and 18 was far too below the threshold required. So there was no real way to choose Kael'thas, and his fight was already a buggy mess, making him one of the longest living bosses to date before a kill was ever claimed upon him in the world. Kael'thas was eventually killed thankfully, but rivaling that of even Ragnaros, taking 130 days in total. It wasn't until patch 2.1 of TBC that the strategy to soulstone your raid was altered. Instead, soulstones could no longer be cast on players not within your group. Additionally, the buff soulstone itself actually gives would be removed if the target were to then leave the group. This didn't entirely stop players from still attempting to use this strategy, however, mainly because you could at least effectively replicate it on 10-man raids since the maximum group size is 40, and you could leave the extra 10 Warlocks in the group and just remain offline, replicating the cheese when necessary. Though for 25-man raids this was hard to achieve for your entire raid, as only just under half of them could retain the buff at a time if you left all the Warlocks offline in the 40-man space. It actually wasn't until early Wrath of the Lich King this strategy was forever removed from the game, making it so that if a soulstone was cast onto you and the Warlock who cast it was not present when the raid combat begins, the buff would be automatically removed, thus ending the offline Warlock method forever. And that's it for this episode of the unknown side of WoW. Be sure to comment if we miss any niche pieces of Warlock history or your thoughts on the obscure pieces of WoW. Also, be sure to leave your ideas for future videos in the comments below, and maybe we can make them into a video someday.